Campaigns in the US have used many materials to express their messages and to promote their candidates over the years. We are engrossed at the moment in a situation where campaigns are becoming more internet and social media involved, and one gets a sense, indeed, that these are areas of the campaign that are taking over. Now, the truth is that the majority of campaign funding that's spent on campaigning is still spent on television ads. And also, the iconic image of the campaign for all of these modern materials remains the button. If you think of an American campaign, you think of the campaign button. And the internet adverts that we have are, in a sense, a modern version of the campaign button, the old campaign message. Campaigners have always used cost-effective ways of getting to their audience right at the beginning. And the earliest campaigns really were in the early 1800s. There are campaign artefacts from before that. It's quite clear that in the 18th century, possibly even in the 17th century, in England, souvenir medallions and handkerchiefs and sashes, rosettes exist for various political and regime, shall we say, events, and usually express regime support. I don't know about other European countries, it may be true there too, but certainly the tradition of this kind of celebratory aspect of political regimes existed before the American political campaign. There is an example of a rosette that Edmund Burke used, for instance, which is held in the Museum of American Political Life in Hartford, Connecticut. And in the early campaigns, in the early elections, shall we say, in the United States, this same kind of aspect existed. So the first campaign buttons were indeed campaign buttons. They were buttons, waistcoat buttons, made by the button makers of Connecticut and neighbouring states, which were impressed with symbols of the new nation to celebrate rather than to campaign for the new nation and its new president, George Washington. We don't really get to competitive items in campaigns till about 1824, 1828. There's some dispute about this. There's not many materials left. But about 1824, 28. And even then it's fairly modest in terms of materials. A few medallions exist, but you do get the beginning of handbills. There is a handbill, for instance, that accuses Andrew Jackson of killing American soldiers when he was a general in the Battle of New Orleans. There's a handbill accusing President John Quincy Adams of importing a gambling equipment into the White House when he's president. Gambling equipment to be a billiard table. So these kinds of materials were beginning to appear. Not widespread, but they were certainly out there. Most of the campaigning still took place between elites and in newspaper articles and so on. By 1840 you get the first campaign that goes on the road. You get William Henry Harrison going on the road or supporters going on the road, and artefacts begin to appear in cities. His opponents accuse him of being the candidate of the log cabin and cider, thinking that this would put him down. In fact, his supporters adopted these symbols and started building log cabins on street corners as their symbol, and having barrels of cider. I don't know whether they were just facsimile or whether they actually had another purpose, but nonetheless, this all became part of it. And also, they started rolling balls, large balls manufactured out of wood and paper, from town to town. And the significance of this ball is lost on me, at least, but nonetheless it was a kind of campaign activity. Street parades started happening. Still, at this time, you have to remember that presidents are elected by the Electoral College, and the Electoral College is, in the mid-19th century, still quite distant from most voters. And it's not until the late part of, the middle to late part of the 19th century that campaigning becomes much more publicly involved. Nevertheless, the artefacts go back right at the beginning, and so you get a sense that candidates were being branded by their campaigns. Not that branding was necessarily a process that was understood or mechanically taken on at the time, but they were. There were artefacts that appealed to the whole family, even though the whole family couldn't vote. So clearly you're trying to set up a kind of sense of the virtue of this candidate. And during the next few minutes, I hope to go through a number of the ways in which these different campaign artefacts have developed and have been used, and show the connection between the entrepreneurial candidates. And after all, we have to remember that America doesn't just have presidential candidates, though all the materials here about that, but also it has 500,000 offices. Any country's got 500,000 elected offices. It's got a lot of entrepreneurial candidates trying to get attention. Entrepreneurial candidates trying to get attention, changing technologies, and the need to get the message, and particularly the name recognition across, result in just a hugely wide set of ephemera in US election campaigns. One, it's perhaps a false connection, but let's go with it anyway. As I said, branding of the candidate included creating artefacts that were not necessarily voters' artefacts. Women in the United States don't get officially, nationally, by constitutional amendment, the vote until into the 20th century. And yet, artefacts were being created that you might think of as being domestic related. Now, partly we have to re-examine that idea that women don't get the vote until after the First World War. Because in fact, certainly for instance in New Jersey, women could vote until 1806 when the law was changed to exclude them. Not all women, it was property owning women. And so widows effectively could vote. Also in some states by the 1830s, some states had introduced the option of women voting for local offices. And then later in the 19th century, some of the western states introduced the vote for women at all levels, because we have to remember that while presidential elections are national, the rules are very often decided at the state level. So women weren't excluded from the vote totally for as long as people might think. Nonetheless, they were definitely second-class voters. They were not as engaged, as allowed to be as engaged as men. And so it might be quite strange to think that even in the 1820s and 1830s, items like ceramic jugs that were definitely kitchen items, maybe decorative lounge items, were being created with presidential candidates' visages on them. And there are sewing kits that certainly would be considered, I think, in the 19th century to be a woman's item that were being created. So this is happening. And the ceramic still continues into into modern life and a domestic item. So here we have an item. It's actually mourning the loss of the President, James A. Garfield, who was assassinated by a deranged office seeker who believed that Garfield was the reason why he hadn't received an office. It's a very sad case. But nonetheless, here we have an item that, it's a presidential celebration, if you like, which is a domestic item. Here, William Howard Taft, again. Some states by now were allowing women voters, but most were not, and certainly it was not a national, it hadn't been allowed by the Constitution. But again, a domestic item. At the same time, you do have the campaign for the women's vote going on, and so this occurs in many ways: direct action, suffragist action, campaign buttons, meetings, and so on. And this rather fine postcard from the I'm not sure exactly what year, but from the teens of the 20th century, something like the design. And then ceramics continue into contemporary elections. Richard Nixon here, Jack Kennedy. Difficult to tell, probably done as a commemorative item, but it's not entirely clear from it. And then later we've got the standard kind of mug that candidates have nowadays, and this fabulous salt and pepper set, a generic campaign item for either side, being you've got the donkey and the elephant. But women voters now, of course, whether the ceramics are aimed at them or not, I don't claim to know what's going on there, whoever they're aimed at now. Women, of course, now not only have the vote, they are the largest proportion of the voting public. About 52% of voters in the presidential election this year will be women. And so it's critically important that candidates make it entirely clear that women are part of their coalition. And this, of course, means not just designing nice items that will appeal to them, but actually designing policy. And these are all the peripheral and ephemeral effects of policy decisions. One thing that we're used to hearing about is the presidential ticket, and whereas now it's the kind of generic statement about the president, the vice president, and then the other party candidates in that state or county or whatever who are related to that. It actually did used to mean something quite specific, and it also gets mixed up with the ballot, because sometimes these old presidential tickets were also referred to as ballots. And these are examples of them. This is a ballot or ticket, presidential ticket, for Abraham Lincoln and his vice president, or his second vice president, Andrew Johnson. His first vice president was a man called Hannibal Hamlin, but second time around they went for Andrew Johnson. In some part to try to unite the country. Johnson was from Tennessee, Hamlin was from Maine, so they were looking to establish their credentials as a party of all sections of the nation. But these tickets, these beautiful tickets, another one for Lincoln and Johnson there, for the Democratic ticket of McClellan and Pendleton here, and another one for the same, were the way you voted in 1864 and days before that, and indeed after that. You went to the polling station, and the candidates and their party supporters would have printed up tickets of this kind, and you voted by picking up the ticket that you supported and posting that in the ballot box. So your ticket becomes your ballot at the same time. And these remarkable items from '64 are special ones that were, as I understand it, used by soldiers in the Civil War, and they have their county name on the bottom, and they're delivered back from the field of battle to the county as part of the election. An utterly remarkable item in this great collection in Oxford. These were replaced steadily in the late 19th century, and certainly in the early 20th century, by what was known in America as the Australian ballot. And this was a uniform ballot which listed all the candidates who were qualified to stand, and on which you put your mark, or sometimes these were done as machines and you pressed a lever, and we're all used to that kind of ballot now. And a critical part in America of the contemporary ballot process is getting people to register so they can actually take part in marking these ballots. And the League of Women Voters is an organisation which is non-partisan, and it works very hard to get people registered. Registration to vote in the USA has become a lot easier in the last generation, but it still is a matter of your individual choice. You fill the form in, you send it in, and you then become registered to vote. You can lose your registration in a variety of ways by not re-registering in certain states. The regulations differ from state to state, and sometimes even in more localised localities than that. So you've always got to keep an eye on whether you are registered to vote and to take part in this. And then, of course, you do go to the modern ballot, and the American ballot is a fine example of democracy in action, but it's also a fine example of perhaps how democracy can become quite daunting. For instance, I come from Leicester in the UK, so I particularly like the ballot of Leicester, Vermont, which Vermont is a state in which it's relatively easy to get onto the ballot, and the Leicester, Vermont ballot very often will list 10 candidates for president, and then a number of candidates for senator, for House of Representatives, for governor, for city alderman, and right down to very local level offices. In some states they vote for offices such as fence watchers are elected, which it's an old colonial office which still exists in some states. Parks supervisors are elected in some towns in Massachusetts. So these ballots can become very large, with very many choices. Effectively, if you do the choice calculation, there are millions of choices. But people aren't making a choice of one out of millions. They're making their choice for their party, or a number of preferred candidates who they might know, or they might think it's about time a woman did this, or some other kind of link that will give them a way through this ballot. But it does very much express the value of the vote, because here you have votes at very local, larger local city level, county level, state level and national level. It expresses the whole of the federal system in this ballot, and you are voting as a different kind of citizen each time in this. So it's a fabulous expression of the democracy. But as I say, when you're faced with one of the ballots that we have in the collection here has 48 different choices on it. When you have 48 different choices, which might include referenda as well, and votes on tax issues and so on and so forth, then it does express the enormity of the responsibility that you're taking on. we hear a great deal about the two major parties, and they dominate the campaign materials, and they can afford to produce a lot, and they spend a lot, spend massive amounts of money. There was a sea change in spending in the late 1800s, 1896. McKinley spends $3.35 million. It's not until the late 1920s that both candidates are spending that kind of money consistently. But since then, it's risen exponentially. So now we have billion-dollar campaigns going on. So you tend to think of the thing as being a major party-dominated, money-dominated system. And that's not an unreasonable thought. Nonetheless, campaign materials do express the wide variety of parties that can get involved. Here we have a bronze badge, a lovely piece of work, from 1924, from the Lafayette campaigns. Robert Lafayette was a left-winger from Vermont, perhaps left-wing is oversimplifying, but nonetheless, a challenge candidate from Vermont, who from Wisconsin, I beg your pardon, who he only took his own state, but was a power within American politics. From earlier time, we have Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party. I throw my hat in the ring and I feel like a bull moose, he says, so there you go. The Progressive Party became symbolised by the bull moose. In the 1960s, the times of stress over civil rights, you had the states' rights parties setting up, quite often a number of them in different states, to express their resistance to the federal imposition of rules. This goes back also 1948, states' rights there. Strom Thurmond, a man who went on to give the longest speech in Senate in history, I think just under 25 hours, if I remember, in order to try to stall a civil rights bill. And Thurmond stood in 1948, and also there was another minor party candidate in 1948, Henry Wallace. Now, Henry Wallace had been Franklin Roosevelt's vice president, and had also been the agriculture secretary, but he felt that the Roosevelt administration was not cleaving to its more progressive ideals, and so in 1948 he ran too. Wallace and Thurmond both got 2.4% of the vote, but because Thurmond's vote was concentrated in a number of southern states, he actually won states and got electoral college votes, whereas Henry Wallace's vote was all over the country and didn't win any electoral college votes. The Communist Party put up candidates until the mid-80s, and then decided it would just become a campaigning party. Goss Hall was his perennial candidate, and here we have Angela Davis standing as his vice presidential candidate. Angela Davis, still involved in politics. And then the Green Party has become, of course, quite significant, and the Libertarian Party has become significant in recent years. Both of them have got to situations where, with their better-known candidates, they have achieved 3% of the vote or thereabouts. Not huge, but enough in a close election to make the difference. And certainly there are some people who still blame Ralph Nader for the fact that Al Gore was not given the 2000 election. You get other kinds of insurgencies. John Anderson was a Republican who felt that Reagan and his supporters were too conservative, and so he moves out of the Republican Party into an independent candidacy, which becomes the National Unity candidacy, and Patrick Lucy was a Democrat who joined him on that ticket. An old party that still goes on, the Prohibition Party, been running candidates since, I believe, the 1830s, and still does so. Prohibition is still part of its programme, but a long list of conservative ideas. And indeed, these parties tend to be the more conservative wing, Constitution Party, Prohibition Party, and so on, or they tend to be the more left wing. So you get the Workers' World Party, the Socialist Party, another Socialist Party candidacy, that one in Spanish. Another Socialist Party candidacy, I think it might be a different branch Socialist Party, David McReynolds, who stood several times for candidacy. And then sometimes perennial Lyndon LaRouche, who claims he's a Democrat, but works both independently and within the Democratic Party for rather with a rather particular worldview, shall we put it, a conspiratorial worldview that includes the Rothschilds and Queen Elizabeth II as trying to take over the world, and attracts a certain amount of support. Given that these elections happen at so many levels, while certainly it is true we have $1 billion campaigns, it's also, again, equally true that for a modest amount of money you can get into the debate at possibly at low level campaigns, possibly, as I say, when you take 3 or 4% at the national level, at a higher level, you can affect the debate as a minor party and affect and swing the major parties to some degree. Currently, and we're in 2012, the two major parties are themselves so conflicted that I'm not sure that minor voices like this get in. So it needs the context, but they are there. One of the key things that we've been saying is that the entrepreneurial candidate, the entrepreneurial party, where in America it tends to be the entrepreneurial candidate, uses the materials to hand, uses the ways that they think they'll get across. And it does lead to this fabulous variety of materials, some of which are fairly straightforward. So you have the buttons and sashes turn into jewellery, in this case jewellery with peanuts on because it's 1976, it's Jimmy Carter, the peanut farmer, or dealer in agricultural futures, who is the candidate. Sometimes, perhaps slightly less easy to explain, Estes Kefauver's soap, although it's the symbol, the message is we're going to clean up on crime and corruption, and so matchbooks were very popular, less popular now because there's fewer smokers now, but were very popular for many years. Goldwater here using a matchbook, but also he used his name very skillfully. The water, the gold, he used to have some of his buttons said AUH2O, gold water, but also he had a nice line in rain bonnets to go with the gold water, I suppose, but also a handkerchief there. There's a wide variety of pens you might expect, balloons, refrigerator magnets, a nice mirror from Clinton and Gore, packs of cards with the candidate images on, dolls of various kinds. This one of Jesse Jackson clings to your finger or your clothes or whatever you wish. You can use it instead of a button, instead of a campaign button clinging. This multiple Russian-style doll of McCain, I'm not sure it does him any justice, and certainly having many of them may not help his case, but nonetheless, it's another form. A doll called Smush Bush, to relieve your anxieties as the campaign goes on, is another one. A money clip here to roll your dollars in, the dollars that perhaps you haven't given to the campaign. There was a fashion for some time for bubblegum cigars. So here's a Dukakis one, Fritz Mondale and Ronald Reagan. Each of them, I haven't seen those around for some years. I'm quite surprised they lasted that long. But that was one fashion for a while. clothing of various kinds, lots and lots of t-shirts and sweatshirts, as you imagine, hats here, a tennis headband here, another example. Sometimes they are for the candidate, sometimes they're against, usually for in this case. Sometimes generic. Here we have a paperweight called a dead weight of a dead elephant, a democratic item, celebrating, as they thought in 1988, the last years of the Republican Party. It's not quite worked out that way. It often doesn't. Another, I think you can find, I think is a negative candidate, a Hillary nutcracker. Actually quite a nice doll, apart from the image it projects of her, particularly when compared to her opponent in 2008, where here we've got this nice soft, friendly doll for Obama. Because one of the things that Obama's had to face is the attack of the birthers, who believe that he was not born in the USA, and so we have, as one of the t-shirts here, made in the USA, and indeed they followed this up in 2012 with a sweatshirt that has that on the front and has on the back a copy of his birth certificate from Hawaii. So many types of materials, many types of messages, some of them clearly done for entertainment purposes, but also all of them done to enthuse people into the campaign. And very often in recent years, as I said at the beginning, things have moved towards the internet. Things before that even were moving towards mass campaigning through television, and before that mass campaigning through radio. But these materials have maintained their place in the campaign, and particularly the more elaborate ones, in those most enthusiastic about the campaign. There are ways of keeping people involved, of making you special because of your involvement in this candidate's campaign and taking that kind of democracy forward. They're easy to laugh at, they are entertaining, they are also an expression of, amongst at least part of the population, a genuine engagement in democratic politics.